The auctioneer's gavel hadn't even finished falling when Dale Pruitt leaned over the railing and said it loud enough for half the yard to hear. "There she goes. Fat girl just bought herself 47 ways to go broke." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Men in dusty hats elbowed each other. A woman near the water trough covered her smile with her hand but didn't bother looking away. Abigail Harper stood in the middle of that auction yard, receipt clutched in both hands, and she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just looked at the pen full of old, scarred, half-lame pigs that nobody else had wanted, and she thought, good. That means they're mine. Nobody in Callow Creek Valley knew what she was planning, and she intended to keep it that way. If you've ever been laughed at for believing in something nobody else could see, stay with us. This story is for you. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Abigail's story is going to travel. Don't miss what's coming, because the valley is never going to be the same. The morning Abigail Harper turned 27. She woke up to a water pump that had frozen solid, a property tax notice wedged under the front door, and a spider the size of a silver dollar sitting directly in the center of her only good skillet. She dealt with the spider first, then the pump. The tax notice she set on the kitchen table and stared at while her coffee got cold, because some problems required looking at before they required solving. $312. Due in 40 days. She turned the notice face down and went to feed the chickens. That was how Abigail Harper handled most things. Not by pretending they weren't there, but by deciding the order in which they were going to get dealt with. Her mother had been the same way. Her father too, before the illness took him, before the debt started stacking up like firewood nobody had gotten around to splitting. She had inherited the Harper homestead the way most people inherit trouble, all at once, without warning, and with more attached to it than anyone had bothered to mention up front. The property sat on 43 acres of rocky hillside at the far end of the valley, where the creek ran shallow and the soil was too stubborn for wheat and too thin for corn. Her parents had made it work through a combination of stubbornness, creativity, and the kind of resourcefulness that doesn't get written about in newspapers because it mostly just looks like people refusing to quit. Her father had run a small smokehouse operation out of the stone building behind the main barn. Nothing commercial, mostly for neighbors and seasonal trade, but the craft of it had sunk into Abigail's bones the same way the smell of hickory smoke had sunk into the walls. She had learned it without meaning to, the way children learn most things. By watching, by being nearby, by caring without realizing she was caring. After he died, she'd shut the smokehouse down. The grief was too fresh and the debts were too immediate, and there were exactly too many things to hold at once. She'd kept the chickens, sold the last of the cattle, taken in mending work from 3 families in town, and spent 14 months doing the math on a napkin every single night before she went to bed. The math was not encouraging. She'd tried applying for a bank loan in September. The loan officer, a soft-handed man named Gerald Holt, who smelled of bay rum and poor intentions, had looked at her across his desk with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and dismissive at the same time, which is a difficult combination to pull off and says something unflattering about the amount of practice he'd had at it. "Miss Harper," he'd said, "I have to be honest with you. The property's assessed value doesn't support the amount you're requesting, and frankly, a single woman operating a livestock operation alone, well," he'd paused there. Let the silence do the rest of the work. "Well, what?" she'd asked. He'd looked at her over his glasses. "These things tend to require a certain kind of, physical endurance." She'd understood what he meant. She wasn't foolish enough to pretend she hadn't. She was a big woman, had been her whole life, broad through the shoulders, thick through the middle, the kind of frame that made people in small towns feel entitled to opinions they hadn't been asked for. She'd spent 27 years learning when to be angry about it and when to save the energy for something useful. That afternoon in Gerald Holt's office, she'd chosen useful. She thanked him politely, walked out with her chin level, and drove the wagon home by herself in the rain. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the napkin and the pencil, and she did the math a different way. The livestock auction in Callow Creek ran the last Saturday of every month. She had been attending since she was a child, trailing behind her father, learning the language of it, how to read an animal's condition in 10 seconds, how to tell the difference between a seller hiding a problem and a seller who simply didn't know better, how to wait. Her father had always said the best deals happened right at the end, when the buyers were tired and the sellers were desperate, and everyone just wanted to go home. For the past 6 months, she had been watching one particular category of animal with very specific attention: old pigs. Not piglets, not prime breeding stock, not the fat young barrows that the bigger ranchers bid on with easy confidence. The old ones. The ones that had lived long enough to develop flavor in their fat and character in their meat. The ones that nobody wanted because they were past their commercial prime, and feeding them through winter felt like throwing money at a problem. Ranchers culled them. Sometimes they sold them for nearly nothing just to be rid of them. Sometimes they didn't even bother bringing them to auction at all. Abigail had spent 6 months reading everything she could find about heritage pork, about old curing methods, about what the great chefs in the eastern cities were starting to call terroir. The idea that what an animal eats and how it lives comes through in the taste of its meat. She had spent 6 months reading her father's old notebooks, the ones nobody else had thought to look at, the ones where he'd written down temperatures and times and wood combinations and observations in his small, cramped handwriting like he was documenting something sacred. And then she had spent 6 months eating cold suppers and mending other people's clothes and doing the math over and over on the napkin until she was certain, not hopeful, not optimistic, but genuinely, concretely certain, that her plan could work. The $43 she'd borrowed from her mother's cousin Ruth. The rest she'd scraped together herself. She arrived at the auction that Saturday morning in the dark, before most of the other buyers, and she found the pen near the back where 47 old pigs had been gathered from 5 different farms. They were not pretty animals. 3 of them were limping. 1 had a torn ear. Most of them were thin in the way that suggested they'd been poorly fed through the previous winter rather than the way that suggested actual illness. And Abigail knew the difference because she had spent 2 weeks teaching herself to tell it apart. She checked each one, quietly, methodically, without drawing attention. She pressed her hands against flanks and checked eyes and watched the way they moved when she walked through them. She was looking for something specific, and she found it in 41 of the 47, the deep-chested, heavy-shouldered build that meant these animals had good genetics buried under bad circumstances. The other 6 she marked mentally and gave a wide berth. By the time Dale Pruitt made his comment from the railing, she had already decided what she was going to pay and what she was not going to pay. And she'd bid with the quiet economy of someone who had done the math so many times it had stopped feeling like risk and started feeling like arithmetic. She got them for $9 less than she'd budgeted. The walk home was the hard part. Abigail didn't own a livestock trailer. She had not been able to borrow one on short notice, and she wasn't about to pay the Carter boys their hauling fee, which was more than she could spare and came with opinions she hadn't solicited. So she walked them. 4 miles up the main road and then off onto the track that ran along the creek, 47 old pigs moving at the pace of 47 old pigs, which is to say, considerably slower than she would have preferred. It took most of the afternoon. She passed through town twice, once because the road went that way, and once because she needed to cut through the feed store lot to get around a washed-out section of track. Both times, people stopped what they were doing. A man outside the barber shop. 2 women on the porch of the dry goods store. A group of boys who should have been in school. Everyone looking at the big young woman in the worn coat, walking her strange collection of decrepit livestock home through the mud like she knew something none of them did. She did know something none of them did. She just wasn't ready for them to know it yet. Old Hector Graves, who had run the largest cattle operation in the valley for 30 years, and had twice mentioned to people that he thought the Harper place should have been sold when her father died, was sitting on the fence outside his property when she came past. He looked at the pigs. He looked at her. He shook his head the way men shake their heads when they have decided they are watching someone make a mistake. So obvious, they almost feel sorry for the person making it. "Going to be a cold winter, Abigail," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. "I know. Pigs eat a lot in cold weather." "These ones won't be eating long," she said, and kept walking. He called something after her, but she was already past the fence line and didn't turn around. She got the pigs into the lower pasture just before dark. She stood at the gate in the last of the light, watching them settle, listening to them breathe and root and complain quietly to each other in the language of pigs, and she felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has done something that cannot be undone. Not regret, just the weight of commitment. The weight of having crossed from planning into doing. She went inside and ate a bowl of cold beans and did not look at the tax notice, because she had already decided the order of things, and tonight was for sleeping. She was up before dawn. The smokehouse was in worse shape than she'd let herself fully acknowledge until she was actually standing inside it with a lantern, looking at what winter and neglect had done to the stone and mortar and the iron fittings. The main firebox was intact. Her father had built things to last. But the hanging racks had rusted through in 2 places, and the vent dampers needed replacing, and the whole structure needed to be resealed before it could hold smoke the way it needed to hold smoke. She made a list. She crossed off the things she couldn't afford and added them to a second list of things she was going to have to figure out differently. She was good at the second list. She had been living off the second list for 2 years. The first week, she didn't touch the smokehouse. She spent it learning the pigs. This was not something she had anticipated being as complicated as it turned out to be, which was the first honest surprise of the whole enterprise. She had spent months reading about heritage breeds and flavor development and the chemistry of fat and muscle, but reading about pigs and spending 12 hours a day with 47 specific pigs who had their own specific personalities and territorial arrangements and opinions about where the feed bucket should be placed. Those were different educations entirely. There was one old sow, the biggest of the group, with a dark patch on her left shoulder and an expression that could only be described as chronically unimpressed. Abigail started calling her Senator. The Senator had a particular spot near the creek bank where she preferred to stand in the mornings. And if another pig was in that spot, she would simply walk into it until the other pig moved without apparent hurry or hostility, simply with the absolute confidence of an animal who had been doing this longer than any of the others and had no interest in debating the matter. Abigail found herself respecting this. She had read that acorn-fed pigs produced a fundamentally different quality of fat, sweeter, more complex, with a particular nuttiness that ran all the way through the meat. The valley's hills were studded with old white oaks, and in the fall they dropped more acorns than anything on the ground could eat. Nobody had thought to use them for anything because nobody had thought to. Abigail spent 3 days building a simple fence system that allowed the pigs to rotate through the hillside pastures systematically, hitting fresh ground every few days, rooting and eating their way through what the valley had been leaving on the ground for free for as long as anyone could remember. She supplemented with the windfall apples from the 2 old trees along the east fence line, and with pumpkins she'd grown in the kitchen garden over the summer, more than she could use herself, which had seemed like poor planning at the time and now seemed like the opposite. She bartered 2 months of mending work for fresh buttermilk from the dairy 3 miles down the road, because the old lactic acid fermentation research she'd found in her father's notebook suggested it did something specific and useful to the gut flora of pigs that were being prepared for long cure processing. All of this took more hours than the day seemed to contain. She slept poorly. She woke up thinking about moisture content and salt ratios, and the specific way her father had described the smell of a smokehouse that was running at exactly the right temperature. Not too hot, not too cool, just that particular sweet dark smell that meant everything was going the way it was supposed to go. She had not reproduced that smell yet. She had reproduced several smells that were not that smell, on several nights when she'd stayed in the smokehouse until 2 in the morning, with her father's notebook open on the workbench and a stubbornness that probably qualified as a character flaw, but that she had stopped trying to correct. The second week, her nearest neighbor, Thomas Webb, a quiet man who kept goats and minded his own business with the kind of commitment that bordered on an art form, came by with a jar of apple butter and stood at her fence line looking at the pigs on the hillside for a long moment. "Heard you bought Pruitt's Rejects," he said, "and some others. Cold's coming early this year." "I've heard that from a few people," she said. He nodded, looked at the hillside again. "Your daddy had a smokehouse." "Still does," she said. "I'm using it." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man revising a theory he'd held for a while. Then he handed her the apple butter over the fence. "He made good smoked pork," Thomas Webb said, "whatever he was doing in there." "I know," she said. "I'm trying to figure out the rest of it." Webb looked at her for another moment, then looked back at the hillside where the senator was navigating an oak root with the methodical confidence that had become familiar. "Well," he said. "All right then." And he went back to his goats. She took the apple butter inside and stood at the kitchen window eating a spoonful of it straight, looking at the smokehouse, thinking about temperature and time, and the particular patience required to turn something that nobody wanted into something nobody could get enough of. Outside, the sky was going purple at the edges, and the first real cold of the season was starting to come down off the ridge. 47 old pigs on the hillside were finding their sleeping arrangements with the low grunting negotiation of animals who had survived enough to have developed preferences about comfort. Abigail Harper washed the spoon, set it on the draining board, picked up her father's notebook, and went out to the smokehouse. She had a lot of work left to do, and she had just decided she wasn't waiting any longer to do it. The lantern threw her shadow long and wavering across the stone wall as she pushed through the door into the dark interior, into the smell of old wood and cold ash and something underneath it, faint, stubborn, still there. That was exactly the smell her father had described. She pressed her hand against the firebox. Still cold. She was about to change that. The first fire she lit in the smokehouse lasted 40 minutes before she put it out herself. Not because something went wrong, because something went right. The smoke that came up through the vent had that particular color, that particular curl that she'd been trying to describe to herself for weeks, based on nothing but her father's handwriting and her own memory of standing in this exact building at age 9, watching him work while she pretended to sweep. She'd put the fire out because she wanted to stop the moment before she ruined it, stand in it, understand what she'd done so she could do it again. That was the first thing she learned about the smokehouse that she hadn't been able to learn from any notebook. It required a different kind of attention than she was used to giving things. Not the hard, driving attention of someone pushing toward a result. Something more like listening. The way you'd listen to a person who was about to tell you something they'd never told anyone, if you were smart enough to stay quiet. She rebuilt the fire the next morning and let it run for 3 hours. The meat she used for the first trial was a small shoulder cut, salted 3 days prior, with a mixture she'd worked out from her father's notes and 2 other sources she'd found at the county lending library. A slim, water-stained volume on commercial curing practices from 40 years ago, and a pamphlet on European charcuterie techniques that someone had donated, and which the librarian had almost thrown out because she couldn't see the use of it. Abigail had checked it out 4 times. The result of that first full trial was edible. Just barely. The smoke penetration was uneven, too heavy on the outer layer and barely present at the center, and the salt ratio was slightly wrong in a way she couldn't quite quantify yet, but could absolutely taste. She sat on the smokehouse floor eating a piece of it cold and making notes in the margin of her own notebook, not her father's, which she kept clean, trying to put the problem into language precise enough to actually solve it. She tried again 4 days later. Better, still wrong in a different way. She tried again. The nights were getting colder and the pigs on the hillside were doing something she hadn't fully anticipated, which was thriving. Whatever the combination of acorns and apples and buttermilk and rotating pasture was doing to those animals, it was visible. Their coats were changing. Their condition was improving in a way that was slow enough to be real and steady enough to be significant. The senator had developed what could only be described as a personality, which was partly the senator's doing and partly the fault of Abigail's own habit of talking to her when nobody was around. "You're looking better," she told the senator one morning, setting the feed bucket down on the frozen ground and watching the old sow regard it with her usual expression of measured skepticism before deciding it was acceptable. The senator did not respond, being a pig, but she did eat the pumpkin pieces first, which Abigail had come to interpret as a form of approval. Thomas Webb came by again in the 3rd week with 24 eggs, and the information that Dale Pruitt had told someone at the feed store that he'd heard the Harper girl was trying to make a go of the smokehouse, and that he gave it until the first hard freeze, which had already happened, and so by his estimation she was already done. Webb relayed this without editorial comment, which was his particular gift. He just handed over the eggs and looked at the hillside and said the pigs were looking well and went back to his goats. She didn't say anything to him about Pruitt. There was nothing to say that wasn't obvious. What she did, that same afternoon, was go back into the smokehouse and start the 5th trial. This one she approached differently. Instead of trying to correct the specific failures of the previous attempts, she went further back to the beginning of the process, back to the salt. She had been using a standard cure ratio, the kind that appeared in every general reference she'd found, because she'd assumed it was a baseline she could adjust from. But her father's notes had a different formulation, one she'd been reluctant to use because she didn't fully understand why he'd arrived at it. It was less salt than recommended, and included something he'd written simply as the brown sugar and the other thing, which had frustrated her for weeks until she'd found, tucked inside the back cover of the notebook, a folded piece of paper in her mother's handwriting with a full recipe for a cure blend that included brown sugar, black pepper, and a small amount of dried juniper berry. Her mother's handwriting on a piece of paper she hadn't known existed. She'd had to sit down on the workbench for a while after she found that. Then she'd gotten up and made the blend exactly as her mother had written it. The difference was immediate and not subtle. Even through the cold morning air, she could tell something had changed in the way the meat was sitting after 24 hours in the cure. The color was deeper. The texture was different in a way she'd have struggled to explain to someone who hadn't spent 4 weeks pressing their thumbs into cured pork and trying to describe what they felt. She gave it the full 3 days before she hung it. She was in the smokehouse at 4 in the morning on the day of the 6th trial, not because she'd planned to be, but because she'd woken at 3:30 and found she couldn't stay in bed. She lay there for 15 minutes, listening to the wind, and then she got up, put her coat on over her nightgown, pulled on her boots, and went out. The valley was still. The kind of still that only happens in the deep middle of the night, in places where no one is close enough to make noise. She could see her breath, and she could see stars, and she could see the dark shape of the smokehouse against the slightly less dark shape of the ridge behind it. And she thought, not for the first time, about her father standing in this same dark doing whatever he did at 4 in the morning that had made the smokehouse what it was. She lit the fire. She used the hickory and the applewood the way she'd been using them, but she adjusted the ratio slightly. More hickory early, more applewood toward the end, based on an observation she'd made during trial 4 about the way the color of the smoke shifted over a long run. She managed the dampers with a care that she recognized, somewhere in the back of her mind, as the same care she'd seen her father give to things that mattered to him. Not anxious, just present. She kept the fire for 6 hours. When she took the meat down and let it rest and then cut into it, the interior was evenly colored all the way through. The right pink, not too deep, not too pale. And the smoke had penetrated in a way that was present without being aggressive, layered in a way she didn't have language for but that her tongue understood immediately. She stood in the smokehouse for a long moment with a piece of it in her hand. Then she went inside and ate breakfast properly for the first time in a week because she thought she deserved it. She still had problems. She always had problems. The scale she was working at was too small to be commercial, and she knew it, but the quality she'd achieved gave her something she hadn't had before, which was a fixed point. A thing she knew was true. You can navigate from a fixed point. You cannot navigate from hoping you're heading in the right direction. She sent Thomas Webb home with a package that Friday, wrapped in paper and tied with kitchen string, with a note that said only, "Honest opinion, please," because he was the kind of man whose honest opinion you could actually use. He came back Sunday morning while she was in the lower pasture moving the water trough, and he stood at the fence until she looked up. "Well?" she said. He thought about it for a moment with the seriousness of a man who understood that she was asking a real question and not a social one. "It's different," he said. "Not different bad. Different like—" He stopped. Tried again. "My wife used to buy smoked pork from a man in Gallatin who people drove 2 hours for. This is like that, but not the same as that." "Better or worse?" she said. "Different," he said again, firmly, like that was the most accurate and therefore the most useful word he had. She thought about that for the rest of the day. Different was what she needed it to be. She had been thinking about markets in a general way since the beginning. The Eastern hotel trade that was growing, the restaurants in the larger towns that were starting to compete on the quality of their provisions. But she'd been keeping those thoughts at a distance until she had something real to sell. Now she had something real, or close enough to it, and the thinking had to become more specific. She didn't know anyone in the hotel trade. She didn't know anyone in the restaurant business. She didn't have money for advertising, and she didn't have a reputation, and she didn't have the kind of connections that open doors in commercial kitchens. What she had was a product that was genuinely different. A few $100s of supplies and feed, a half-rebuilt smokehouse, and the absolute absence of any other option. She wrote 3 letters, one to the Hargrove Hotel in the county seat, addressed to their head of provisions. One to a restaurant she'd read about in a newspaper that she'd saved specifically because the article mentioned the chef sourced unusual provisions from small producers. One to a regional food supplier she'd found in a trade directory at the county lending library, a company called Whitfield and Associates, whose listing noted they specialized in specialty and artisan provisions for upscale establishments. She sent the letters and did not wait for the answers, because waiting felt like something she could not afford in either direction. Instead, she turned the problem of scale into a project. She couldn't increase the number of pigs yet. She was already at the limit of what the hillside pastures could support with the rotation system she'd built. But she could look at the smokehouse capacity and think about whether there was a way to modify the process for larger batches without sacrificing what the sixth trial had taught her. She spent a week on that problem, working in the evenings after the day's animal work was done, drawing diagrams on the back of feed receipts and calculating times and temperatures and wood quantities until she had something that looked, in theory, like it could handle 3 times the volume without compromising the result. In theory. She was suspicious of theory by now, having been educated in the difference between theory and practice by 6 smokehouse trials and 47 pigs with opinions of their own. The letter from Whitfield and Associates arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after she'd sent hers. It was short, professional. It said that a representative of the company would be in the area on the 14th and would be willing to stop by the Harper homestead to view the operation, if Miss Harper was available. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time because she wanted to make sure she wasn't misreading something. She wrote back the same day confirming the 14th. She did not say that the operation currently consisted of 1 repaired smokehouse, 47 aging pigs, and 1 person running it all. She figured that could be presented in person, with context. The 14th was 8 days away. She spent those 8 days in the way she had come to spend every stretch of time that had a defined endpoint, which was to say, with the kind of systematic, relentless focus that probably looked from the outside like she wasn't sleeping, which was because she wasn't. She smoked 2 more batches, refining the process against the standard she'd established in Trial 6. She cleaned the smokehouse until it smelled of nothing but wood and smoke and stone. She repaired the second hanging rack that had been rickety since she'd put it up, and replaced the vent dampers on the secondary flue with better hardware she'd gotten from the blacksmith in town by trading a month of bookkeeping for his shop, which she'd offered because she'd noticed his ledger was a disaster when she'd been in there for something else. She also, because she was not entirely without self-awareness, took one afternoon to deal with several weeks of deferred practical matters, patching the split in her good coat, cleaning her boots properly, doing something intentional with her hair rather than just getting it out of her face. She did this not because she thought it would change how Clara Whitfield, which was the name she'd been given in a follow-up note, saw the product, but because she'd spent enough time around people who made decisions to know that they made them about multiple things at once, and there was no point in making it harder than it needed to be. Clara Whitfield arrived on the 14th in a smart, dark carriage with a driver who stayed with the horses while she came up the path on foot. She was somewhere in her 40s, with the look of someone who had been doing hard commercial work long enough that it had settled into her face as capability rather than wear. She walked through the lower pasture fence gate that Abigail held open without breaking stride, looked at the pigs on the hillside with a professional eye, and said, "How long have they been on that rotation?" "Since I bought them," Abigail said. 10 weeks. "What are you feeding on?" "Acorn and windfall fruit as primary. Buttermilk supplement. Pumpkin when I have it." Clara Whitfield looked at her for a moment. "No grain at all?" "No grain. That's going to affect your timeline to market significantly." "I know," Abigail said. "That's the point." The other woman looked at her again, differently this time, and then looked back at the hillside and then said, "Let's see the smokehouse." Abigail showed her the smokehouse. She showed her the curing process and the wood system and the temperature management approach. She showed her the notebook, her own, not her father's, with the records of every trial, every failure, every adjustment. She did this without apology and without inflation, just here is what I am doing, and here is why, and here is the evidence of how it's going. Clara Whitfield listened. She asked questions that were sharp and specific, and that revealed she understood what she was looking at. When Abigail produced a sample from the most recent batch, already sliced and rested, Clara Whitfield took a piece, ate it, and was quiet for long enough that Abigail had to actively resist saying anything to fill the silence. "Where did you develop this process?" Clara Whitfield asked. "My father had the foundation," Abigail said. "I built from there." "And you're running this alone?" "Yes." "How many animals per batch?" "At current capacity, 8 to 10. I'm working on expanding the smokehouse to triple that." Clara Whitfield set down the rest of her sample and looked out the smokehouse door at the hillside where the senator was engaged in her morning routine of navigating the terrain with serene indifference to everything that wasn't directly in front of her. "The flavor profile is unusual," Clara Whitfield said. I mean that as a specific commercial observation, not a polite compliment. I've been in specialty provisions for 18 years, and I have not tasted that particular combination. The fat quality is the thing. Whatever you're doing with the feed, it's coming through in the fat, and the fat is carrying the smoke differently than standard pork. Abigail had suspected this. She hadn't had the vocabulary for it until now. I have 3 clients who have been asking me for something like this for 2 years, Clara Whitfield said. High-end hotel dining. They want provenance. They want method. They want something they can put on a menu card and tell a story about. This, she nodded at the smokehouse, the hillside, the whole 43 acres. This is a story. I'm not in the business of stories, Abigail said. I'm in the business of making the best product I can make and finding people who want to buy it. Clara Whitfield looked at her. Then she did something Abigail hadn't expected, which was smile. Not a sales smile, something that seemed genuine and slightly surprised. That's the right answer, she said. They negotiated for 40 minutes at the kitchen table, with the tax notice that Abigail had never thrown away sitting face down on the end of the table because she'd forgotten to move it. Clara Whitfield named figures. Abigail countered figures. They went back and forth in the way of 2 people who both knew what they were doing and had some respect for the fact that the other one also knew what they were doing. The final number was not as high as Abigail had hoped, and considerably higher than the floor she'd privately set, and it came with a schedule that was aggressive but not impossible if the smokehouse expansion went the way she'd planned. Clara Whitfield shook her hand at the door and said she'd send the formal paperwork within the week, and that she looked forward to receiving the first shipment on the agreed date, and that she had one more thing to say which was not commercial. I've been to this valley 4 times in the past 6 years, she said. I've stopped at the Graves operation and the Pruitt operation and 2 others you'd know by name. None of them produced anything that surprised me. She paused. This surprised me. She went down the path to her carriage and drove away. Abigail stood in the doorway until the carriage was out of sight. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers she'd written during the negotiation and did the math, the real math, the kind that included the tax notice and the borrowed money and the feed costs for the next 3 months. She turned the tax notice face up. She ran the numbers 3 times. Each time they said the same thing, which was that if the smokehouse expansion worked and the production schedule held, and nothing went badly wrong that she hadn't anticipated, she had a path out. Not a wide path, not a comfortable path. A path that required everything to go reasonably well for several months in a row, which was not historically the way things had gone for Abigail Harper. But it was a path. She went out to the smokehouse and started planning the expansion, working by lantern light on the drawings she'd already started, adjusting them now against the actual numbers on the contract she was going to receive, making the calculations concrete. She worked until she couldn't see the paper properly anymore, and then she went to bed. Outside on the dark hillside, 47 pigs moved through the oak shadow and the cold air and did whatever pigs do in the last hours before dawn, which she'd never quite figured out and had stopped worrying about. Whatever it was, they were doing it well. She could tell by the way they sounded, settled, purposeful, getting on with things, which was, she thought, on the edge of sleep, exactly the right approach. The formal paperwork from Whitfield and Associates arrived on a Wednesday, 7 days after Clara's visit, just as Abigail had started to wonder whether she'd imagined the whole thing. She hadn't imagined it. The contract was 4 pages typed, with specific quantities and delivery dates and pricing that matched exactly what they'd negotiated at the kitchen table. She read it twice, signed it, and sent it back the same day with the county postal rider, and then she stood in the yard for a moment doing nothing in particular, which was unusual enough that the senator looked up from across the fence and watched her with mild curiosity before returning to the serious business of the morning. The first delivery was due in 6 weeks. 6 weeks to complete the smokehouse expansion, run 2 more production batches at the new capacity, and deliver product that met the standard she'd set in the 6th trial. Not approximately met, not mostly met, but actually met, because Clara Whitfield had not struck her as a woman who accepted approximately. She went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and made a list of everything that had to happen in the next 42 days. The list was long enough to be discouraging if she looked at it all at once, so she stopped looking at it all at once and started looking at the first item, which was getting the stone mortar for the smokehouse expansion from the quarry outside town before the ground froze too deep for the cart to make it up the track. That problem she could solve today. The quarry ran by a man named Patterson, who charged fair prices and kept short accounts. And she'd done enough small business with him over the past 2 years that he let her take the material on a 30-day note without requiring her to explain herself. She loaded the cart herself. Patterson's boy offered to help, and she let him because she was not so committed to independence that she'd refuse useful assistance, which was a distinction she'd been working on, and got back to the homestead by mid-afternoon with enough material to start the first section of the expansion that same evening. She worked on it every night after the animal work was done, in the lantern light, learning as she went because she had never actually laid stone mortar before, and her father's notes had nothing useful on the subject. Her first section was crooked in a way that was structurally acceptable but aesthetically terrible. She looked at it the next morning and decided she didn't care. It would hold smoke, and that was its only job. The second section was less crooked. The third was almost straight. Thomas Webb came by midway through the second week and observed the work in progress without comment for a while, then picked up a trowel and showed her a technique for getting a more even bed that he'd apparently learned from his father-in-law 30 years ago and had never had occasion to use since. She watched him do it once and then did it herself, and it was noticeably better. "Where'd your father-in-law learn that?" she asked. "He built a church in Tennessee," Webb said, "before the war." "You could have told me this 2 weeks ago." "You didn't ask 2 weeks ago," he said, which was fair. She had the expansion finished by day 23, which was 3 days ahead of where she'd told herself she needed to be, which meant she had 3 days of margin she hadn't planned on, and she used them not to rest, but to run a test fire in the expanded configuration and learn what it did differently from what she expected, because it always did something differently from what she expected. What it did this time was run hotter on the left side than the right, because of something about the way the new stone section connected to the old one that she hadn't fully accounted for. It took her 2 days to figure out the damper adjustment that compensated for it. She was irritated at herself for not anticipating it, and then stopped being irritated because she hadn't known enough to anticipate it. And that was the honest truth of the matter. The first production batch at expanded capacity went into cure on day 26. She used her mother's blend exactly. She'd stopped second-guessing it after the 6th trial, made clear that it was not a thing that needed improvement, only consistency. And she worked through the curing period with a careful eye on the temperature in the curing room, because the weather had turned unpredictable in the way of late autumn in the valley, veering between cold enough for ice and warm enough to make her nervous about meat left to cure in uncertain temperatures. She slept with the smokehouse door cracked twice during that stretch, just to make sure the temperature was holding, lying in her coat on the narrow workbench inside, because running back and forth from the house seemed like a waste of time she didn't have. The batch came out right. Not right the way the 6th trial had come out right. The feeling of surprise and relief that had made her sit down on the smokehouse floor and eat cold pork at 7 in the morning. This time it came out right the way a thing comes out right, when you've done the work to understand it and the work held, which is a quieter feeling and in some ways a better one. She packaged it herself, the way Clara had specified, wrapped in paper and packed in the wooden boxes she'd had made at the carpenter's shop in town, and she sent it on the Whitfield and Associates pickup that came through the Valley Road on the agreed date with a driver who took the boxes without ceremony and drove away without complimenting her on anything, which suited her fine. 3 days later, Clara Whitfield sent a message through the postal rider. First delivery received and inspected. Quality consistent with sample. First of 3 clients confirmed satisfied. Remaining 2 to receive product this week. Will advise. Abigail read the message and then went out and started working on the second batch. The second message from Clara came 10 days after the first. All 3 clients confirmed. 1 has doubled their standing order effective next shipment. Second has referred a colleague at the Meridian Hotel in Carver. I am arranging an introduction. Be prepared to discuss volume. She read that one twice. Then she went and found her notebook, her own, not her father's, and started doing the math on what discuss volume might mean, and what it would require, and where the gaps were between what she could currently produce and what she was about to be asked to produce. The gaps were significant. She had the smokehouse capacity now, after the expansion, to handle 3 times her original volume. What she did not have was 3 times the number of animals at the right stage of the process. The pigs she'd bought at auction in October were still 8 to 10 weeks from where she needed them to be, and while the quality of the product depended on that timeline, and she was not going to compromise it, She was going to need more animals in the pipeline. Animals she didn't have and couldn't afford to buy without capital she didn't yet have. She sat with that problem for 2 days, which was longer than she usually sat with problems, because the solutions she was seeing all had complications attached to them that she didn't love. She could try the bank again. She rejected that almost immediately, not from pride but from practical assessment. Gerald Holt had not become more imaginative in the past 2 months, and even if he had, a bank loan at this stage came with a timeline that didn't match her need. She could approach her cousin Ruth again. Ruth had been generous once, and Abigail didn't like the feeling of going back a second time to a well that had already given. She could approach Clara Whitfield about an advance against future deliveries. This was the option she liked least, and the one she kept coming back to because it was the one that was most likely to work, and also the one that required her to show Clara exactly how thin the margin was, which felt like a kind of vulnerability she hadn't planned on. She was still working through this on a Friday afternoon when a wagon she didn't recognize came up the track from the road. It was a good wagon, not ostentatious but well-maintained, the kind that suggested its owner had money and no particular interest in advertising it. The driver was a man of about 60 with the calm, deliberate movements of someone who didn't waste much on hurry. Sitting beside him was a woman Abigail didn't know. Somewhere in her mid-50s with a straight back and work-worn hands and the look of someone who had spent a long time outdoors making assessments of animals. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help and looked at the hillside the way Abigail had come to recognize as the look of someone who understood what they were seeing. "Miss Harper?" she said. "Yes." "Naomi Carter." She didn't offer her hand immediately, the way some people didn't until they'd made up their mind about something. "Marcus Whitfield mentioned your operation to his wife, who I understand you've met." Abigail hadn't known Clara had a husband, much less that he apparently talked to people. "I've met Mrs. Whitfield, yes. She mentioned your product to a colleague of hers who runs provisions for the Meridian Hotel. That colleague mentioned it to me." Naomi Carter looked at the hillside again. "I have 70 acres of hill pasture 7 miles north of here that's been producing heritage hogs for 15 years. I have more animals than I can process, and a smokehouse that my husband built before he died 3 years ago, that I haven't touched since because I don't know what he knew about running it." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "And? And you apparently know what you're doing with a smokehouse," Naomi Carter said, turning back from the hillside to look at Abigail directly. "And you apparently need more animals. I'd like to know if those two facts add up to anything useful." The conversation that followed was not the quick kind. They talked for 2 hours at the kitchen table, with the driver waiting outside because Naomi Carter had told him to wait, and he clearly did what Naomi Carter told him. They talked about animals and process and timelines and the particular challenges of scaling a product that depended on time and consistency and couldn't be rushed without becoming something different from what it was supposed to be. Naomi Carter was not warm, exactly, but she was precise and honest in a way that Abigail found easier to work with than warmth. She said directly what she knew, what she didn't know, what she wanted, and what she was not willing to do. She had an opinion about everything and stated it plainly, and was willing to hear a counterargument if it was based on something real. She reminded Abigail, in some complicated way, of her father, not in personality, but in the particular quality of attention she brought to things she took seriously. At some point, a third person entered the conversation, which was when the driver knocked on the door and said quietly to Naomi Carter that Lucy was wondering if she could look at the pigs. Naomi Carter said yes without explaining who Lucy was, and a few minutes later a girl of about 14 appeared at the kitchen window, having clearly already gone around to the lower pasture fence, pressing her face close to the glass and signing something with her hands at Naomi Carter, who signed back without missing a beat in the conversation she was having with Abigail. "Your daughter?" Abigail said. "My husband's daughter from his first marriage," Naomi said. "She's been with me since he died. She doesn't speak, never has, but she knows livestock better than most grown men I've met. She wants to know if the large one with the dark shoulder is as bossy as she looks." Abigail looked at the senator, who was in her customary spot near the creek bank, observing the newcomer at the fence with the patient skepticism she brought to most things. "Tell her yes," Abigail said. Naomi signed something to Lucy, and Lucy signed something back, and Naomi made a sound that was close to a laugh, which seemed to surprise her slightly. "She says she likes her," Naomi said. They reached an agreement before Naomi Carter's driver had finished his third cup of coffee, which Abigail had offered because it seemed like the thing to do. The arrangement was structured as a partnership rather than a simple supply deal. Naomi would provide animals from her herd on a rotating basis aligned with Abigail's production schedule, and they would share both the production costs and the revenue from the combined output. Naomi's smokehouse, which Abigail had not seen but which Naomi described in enough detail to suggest it was well built, would become a second production facility once Abigail had learned its particular character and adapted her process to it. It was a bigger arrangement than Abigail had been planning for. She said as much. "I know," Naomi said, "but you're going to outgrow what you have here in 3 months regardless. The question is whether you want to build something real or just delay the problem." "I've been building something real since October," Abigail said, and there was an edge in it that she didn't fully intend. Naomi Carter looked at her for a moment and then nodded once. Not a concession, exactly, more like a recalibration. "I can see that," she said. "That's why I'm here." After Naomi and Lucy and the driver had gone, Abigail walked the perimeter of the lower pasture in the early dark. Not because she needed to check on the pigs, but because she needed to move and think at the same time, which was when her thinking worked best. The arrangement was good. She knew it was good. It solved the animal supply problem and the capital problem and the scale problem all at once. And Naomi Carter clearly knew what she was doing with livestock, which meant the quality of the animals entering the process would be reliable in a way it hadn't been when she was buying whatever came through the auction. What it also was complicated. Having a partner meant having another person's priorities and judgments and ways of doing things in the middle of a process she had built alone and understood in a way that was partly technical and partly something harder to articulate. A feel for it that had come from failing over and over in her own smokehouse until the failures taught her something. She wasn't sure how that translated to a partnership. She wasn't sure it translated at all without a period of friction and adjustment that she had no experience navigating. She didn't say any of this to anyone because there wasn't anyone to say it to, and also because saying it out loud would have made it sound like she was uncertain about a decision she'd already made. She was uncertain about it. That didn't mean it was the wrong decision. The meeting with the Meridian Hotel buyer happened 12 days later, in the lobby of the hotel itself, which was the largest building Abigail had been inside in 3 years, and which smelled of wood polish and coal smoke, and the particular kind of money that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. The buyer's name was Garrison Hale. He was a compact man in his late 40s who managed an expression of professional neutrality, so practiced it had probably become involuntary. He had a small plate on the table in front of him with 3 cuts of her product, which Clara had sent ahead, and he had eaten all of it before Abigail sat down, which she took as a better sign than if he'd left any of it. He asked her 9 questions about process and provenance and production timeline, and she answered all 9 without hedging. He asked about volume, and she gave him the numbers she'd worked out with Naomi's capacity factored in. He looked at those numbers for a moment. "You're confident about this timeline?" he said. "I'm confident about the process," she said. "The timeline depends on maintaining that process at scale, which I'm working on." "That's not the same thing as confidence." "No," she said. "It isn't. But I'd rather tell you that than tell you yes and deliver late, which I won't do." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that shifted very slightly from professional neutrality toward something resembling genuine assessment. "The Harrison house in Carver is also interested," he said. "They heard about you from the same source I did." "I know," she said, which she didn't, but she'd suspected, and it seemed better to have suspected correctly than to appear surprised. "They'll offer you a better per-unit price to secure exclusivity," Hale said. "I know what exclusivity costs," she said. "I'm not selling it." He nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they've tested something and gotten the answer they were hoping for but hadn't expected. They agreed on terms before the hotel's lunch service started. Abigail drove home through the early afternoon with the signed agreement folded in her coat pocket, and she stopped once, on the ridge where the road crested before dropping into the valley, and she sat with the horses for a moment and looked at the view she'd looked at her whole life. The Harper homestead was visible from there if you knew where to look. The dark line of the creek, the pale hillside with its scattered oaks, the stone buildings that had been in various states of disrepair since she could remember, and which were now, for the first time, in the process of being genuinely used rather than just maintained. She sat there for a while. Then she drove home. Dale Pruitt passed her on the road about a mile from the turnoff to her property. He was going the other way in his own wagon, and he slowed when he saw her, the way people slow when they're deciding whether to acknowledge someone or pretend they haven't seen them. He looked at her. She looked at him. She nodded. He nodded back without warmth, but without the smirk she'd seen at the auction either, and drove on. She didn't give the interaction more significance than it deserved. Dale Pruitt's opinion was his own business, and she had enough of her own business to attend to. Back at the homestead, she changed out of her good coat and went directly to the smokehouse, where the third production batch was in its final hours. She checked the dampers and checked the temperature and stood in the door for a moment, listening to the particular sounds that the fire made at this stage of a long run. A lower, slower sound than the early hours, settled and steady. The sound of something doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The senator was watching from the pasture fence, which she did sometimes in the late afternoon when the light was changing. It was unclear to Abigail whether the old sow had any interest in or awareness of the smokehouse and its operations, but the watching had a quality of attention to it that she had come to find, in some obscure way, companionable. "We have a contract with the Meridian," she told the senator. The senator regarded her briefly and then turned and walked away toward the creek bank with the unhurried authority of an animal who had made her peace with the world on her own terms. Abigail went back inside the smokehouse. She had 3 weeks until the first Meridian delivery, and she intended to spend them learning everything there was to know about what happened when you took a process you'd built alone in one place and tried to teach it to a second location, a second structure, a second set of stone walls that had their own particular way of holding heat. She had a feeling it wasn't going to be like the book said. It never was. Naomi Carter's smokehouse was built from different stone than Abigail's. That was the first thing she noticed when she arrived at the Carter property on a cold Tuesday morning 3 days after the Meridian meeting, her notebook under her arm and a particular kind of wariness in her chest that she recognized as the feeling of walking into a situation where she didn't yet know what she didn't know. The stone was darker, denser, the kind quarried from deeper in the ridge where the mineral content was different, and it held temperature differently. She could tell that just by pressing her hand against the wall and feeling the way the cold moved through it, or rather didn't move through it, staying closer to the surface than her own smokehouse stone did. Her father had once said, in one of the notebook entries she'd practically memorized, that every smokehouse had a personality of its own, and you had to learn it the same way you learned a person, which was mostly by paying attention and making mistakes, and not confusing your assumptions for facts. She stood in the doorway for a while before she went in. Naomi was behind her, not hovering, just present. She'd met Abigail at the fence line when the wagon came up and walked her directly here without the kind of preliminary conversation that some people used to ease into things. Abigail had appreciated that. They were both past the point of needing to be eased into anything. "When did he last run it?" Abigail asked. 3 years and 4 months ago, Naomi said. "I know because it was 2 weeks before he got sick." Abigail looked at the firebox. Someone had cleaned it out at some point. The ash was old and minimal, but the wood smell was still there, deep in the stone, the accumulated character of 15 years of fires. She crouched down and examined the damper mechanism, which was better engineered than her own. Naomi's late husband, whoever he'd been, had known what he was building. "He learned this somewhere specific?" she asked. "His grandfather," Naomi said. "Carolina's. They did it a particular way down there, and he learned it young and never saw a reason to change it. Did he write any of it down?" There was a pause long enough to be meaningful. "Some," Naomi said. Abigail stood up and turned around. Naomi was holding a small book, similar in size to the notebook Abigail's father had kept, and she was holding it the way you hold something you've taken out of a place where it's been sitting untouched for over 3 years, with a carefulness that was not entirely practical. "I haven't read all of it," Naomi said. "I started once and then I didn't." Abigail understood that. She'd felt the same way about her own father's notebook in the weeks after he died, before the practical need to actually use it had overridden the grief of opening it. "Can I look at it?" she asked. Naomi handed it over without saying anything. She spent an hour in the smokehouse with that book, standing in the cold, reading the handwriting of a man she'd never met, and what she found in it was both useful and unexpected. Useful because his temperature observations were detailed and his wood preferences were specific and his timing notes were precise enough to actually work from. Unexpected because his approach differed from her father's in several key ways that were not obviously inferior, just different. Variations that suggested he'd arrived at his method through his own long process of trial and adjustment, the same way her father had, the same way she had, each of them working alone in their own stone building towards something they could feel but couldn't fully explain. She found, toward the back of the book, a passage where he'd written about the smoke itself. Not the wood or the temperature or the meat, but the smoke as a thing with its own nature that had to be respected rather than controlled. He'd written it in the way of someone who'd been thinking about something for a long time and was trying to get it down before the thought got away from him. She read it twice. Then she closed the book and handed it back to Naomi, who was standing outside the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold. "Your husband was good at this," Abigail said. Naomi looked at the book in her hands for a moment. "I know," she said. "They didn't say anything else about it." The first test fire in the Carter Smokehouse happened that afternoon, with no meat involved. Just Abigail learning the way the structure breathed, the way the draw worked, how the heat distributed through the expanded interior before it settled. Lucy was there, sitting on an overturned bucket near the door with a sketchbook on her knees, drawing something that Abigail assumed was the smokehouse, until she got close enough to see it was actually a detailed rendering of the senator, whom Lucy had apparently studied with enough attention during the visit to the Harper place to reproduce her from memory with considerable accuracy. Abigail looked at the drawing for a moment. Lucy noticed her looking and held the sketchbook up, tilting it slightly as though asking a question. "It looks exactly like her," Abigail said. Lucy's expression shifted in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was clearly pleased. She went back to the drawing, adding something to the background that turned out to be the creek bank where the senator took her morning position. Naomi appeared in the doorway, saw Lucy showing Abigail the sketchbook, and something moved across her face that she didn't comment on. She came in and checked the fire and made an adjustment to the left damper. That was the same adjustment Abigail had been about to make. "You've been in here more than you said," Abigail said. "I've looked at it," Naomi said. "I didn't say I hadn't looked. I said I hadn't touched it." That was a distinction Abigail understood. They ran the test fire for 4 hours, and she learned 3 things about the Carter Smokehouse that she hadn't known before. The right side draw was stronger than the left, which was the opposite of her own. The interior held a more even temperature than her building once it reached operating range, which was an advantage. And the ash buildup in the secondary channel happened faster, which would require more frequent management during a production run. She wrote all of it down in her own notebook, and then went home and spent the evening working out how to adapt her process to account for those differences without losing what the process was. She came back Wednesday and Thursday. By Friday, she had a modified procedure specific to the Carter Smokehouse written out in enough detail that someone else could follow it, which was not something she'd ever had to think about before. Her own process existed partly in writing and partly in her hands and her nose, and the particular quality of attention she'd developed over months of failure, and translating that into language precise enough to be genuinely useful to another person was harder than she'd expected, and forced her to articulate things she hadn't known she knew. Naomi read through the written procedure on Friday afternoon at the kitchen table, with Lucy sitting across from her doing homework, or what looked like homework. She had a slate and a piece of chalk, and she was working through something mathematical with a focused expression that suggested she was not finding it simple. "This part," Naomi said, pointing at a section about smoke color, "you're describing something visual. How do I know when I'm seeing it?" "You have to see the reference," Abigail said. "I can't describe it well enough in words. You'd need to run a batch with me present." "Then that's what we do." "I know. I'm saying, it's the part that doesn't transfer through instruction. It transfers through watching." Naomi looked at her. "That's true of most of the things that matter," she said. Lucy looked up from her slate and signed something to Naomi. Naomi watched her hands for a moment and then said, "She wants to know if she can watch too." Abigail looked at Lucy, who was watching her with the same direct, assessing quality of attention she brought to animals. Not rude, just genuinely interested in what the answer was going to be. "Yes," Abigail said. Lucy went back to her slate with an expression of satisfaction. The first joint production run happened the following week. Naomi had animals ready. She'd been managing the rotation on her pastures for 15 years, and she knew her herd the way Abigail was learning to know hers. And the animals she selected for the first batch were, if anything, in better condition than what Abigail was working with, bigger and more developed through the shoulder, with the particular quality of fat that came from long, slow maturation on good pasture. They ran both smokehouses simultaneously for the first time, Abigail managing the Harper smokehouse while Naomi managed hers, Lucy moving between the two properties with a purposefulness that seemed to be her natural state, observing and reporting back through signs to Naomi, who relayed to Abigail what needed relaying. It did not go entirely smoothly. The timing on the Carter smokehouse ran 40 minutes behind where Abigail's procedure said it should, which meant the two batches came out of their respective buildings at different times, which disrupted the packaging and resting schedule she'd planned. She was irritated about this, and Naomi knew she was irritated and chose not to comment on it, which was the right call. Abigail worked through it, adjusted the resting time, and the final product from both buildings was consistent in quality when she evaluated it side by side. But the 40 minutes bothered her. "The wood," Lucy signed to Naomi, who signed it back and then said it aloud for Abigail. Abigail looked at the girl. "What about the wood?" Lucy signed something more extended. Naomi watched and then said, "She says the wood I had in the store for the smokehouse is drier than what you're using. She noticed the color of the smoke was different in the first hour." Abigail stared at her. Then she went and looked at the Carter wood store, and Lucy was right. The wood had been cut and stored longer than what Abigail was using, and drier wood burned hotter in the early stage, which would account for the timing discrepancy and also for a subtle difference in the early smoke character that she'd noticed and attributed to the stone. It wasn't the stone. It was the wood. She went back and looked at Lucy. "How did you see that?" she asked. Lucy shrugged, signed something brief. Naomi smiled, not quite suppressing it. "She says she was watching," Naomi said. Abigail thought about her father saying, "You learn the smokehouse the same way you learn a person." She thought about how she'd learned her own smokehouse. Not by reading, not even entirely by trying, but by being in it, paying attention, watching it the way Lucy had watched the Carter smokehouse for 4 hours during a test fire while ostensibly drawing a pig. "She needs to be part of this," Abigail said. Naomi was quiet for a moment. "She's 14. I know how old she is. I'm saying she should be at both sites during every production run. If she's seen things I'm missing, that's not something I want to work around." Naomi looked at her daughter for a long moment. Lucy was already looking at Naomi, clearly waiting, with the patience of someone who was accustomed to other people making decisions about what she was allowed to be involved in. Naomi signed something to Lucy. Lucy's response was brief and immediate. Naomi made the sound that was close to a laugh again. "She says it's about time," Naomi said. The second joint production run 2 weeks later was better. The timing held within 10 minutes, close enough. And Abigail understood now that the Carter smokehouse would always run slightly ahead of her written procedure during the first phase because of the wood storage, and she'd adjusted the procedure to account for it. Lucy was at both sites, spending the long hours of a production run moving between properties with the Carter driver, who had apparently made peace with spending his Wednesdays transporting a 14-year-old girl between two smokehouses in the cold. She started keeping her own notebook. Abigail noticed it one morning, a small one, similar in size to her father's and Naomi's husband's, sitting on the workbench in the Carter smokehouse with Lucy's handwriting in it. Observations and diagrams and what appeared to be her own temperature notations kept in parallel to Abigail's process records. She didn't say anything about it. She let it be. By the end of December, they were running production out of both facilities on a staggered schedule that Abigail had designed and Naomi had improved and Lucy had annotated in ways that were consistently useful. The volume they were producing was 3.5 times what Abigail had been producing alone in October, and the quality was consistent between the two smokehouses in a way that had taken longer to achieve than she'd originally planned, and that she was genuinely proud of in a way she didn't say out loud. But that was real. Clara Whitfield's messages had shifted in tone. Still professional, still precise, but with a frequency and a specificity that told Abigail the demand was building faster than either of them had anticipated. A fourth client had come through, a restaurant in the county seat that had been trying to source something comparable from 3 other suppliers and had not been satisfied. A fifth was inquiring. The tax notice that had been sitting face down on Abigail's kitchen table for most of the autumn was now gone. She'd paid it in November, on the day the second Whitfield payment arrived, and she'd paid it in full, and she'd stood at the post office counter and handed over the money with the feeling of someone removing a stone they'd been carrying long enough that they'd stopped noticing the weight until it was gone. The loan from her cousin Ruth she paid back in December, with a small addition that Ruth didn't ask for and that Abigail sent anyway. What she had not paid off yet was the larger debt, the accumulated back debt against the property that had been building since before her father died, the debt that was the real reason she'd been doing the math on that napkin every night for 14 months. That was still there. Smaller than it had been, meaningfully smaller, but still there. And she was not the kind of person who confused progress with completion. Hector Graves stopped her at the feed store in late December. He was at the counter when she came in, and he turned when he heard the door and looked at her in a way that was different from the way he'd looked at her in October when she'd walked 47 pigs past his fence. She couldn't have said exactly what the difference was. It wasn't warm, exactly. More like adjusted. "Heard you've been working with Naomi Carter," he said. "Yes." He nodded. "Naomi knows her stock," he said, which was a specific compliment to Naomi and also, sideways, a concession of some kind. "She does," Abigail said. He seemed about to say something else and then didn't, the way people don't when what they'd say would require admitting more than they're ready to admit. He picked up his order from the counter and nodded at her and went to the door, and then he stopped. "Your father would have liked knowing you were using that smokehouse," he said, without turning around. He went out. She stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed, looking at nothing in particular, letting the comment settle. Wherever comments like that settle when someone you've spent months trying not to think too much about says something that turns out to matter. Then she placed her order and went back to work. The problem that arrived in the second week of January was not the kind she'd planned for, which was true of most of the problems that actually mattered. The east wall of her smokehouse, the new section she'd mortared herself, the section that was structurally acceptable but crooked, the section she'd decided not to care about because its only job was to hold smoke, developed a crack along the upper joint. Not a catastrophic crack. Not one that made the building dangerous or non-functional, but a crack that let cold air in at a rate that affected the temperature management during a long run, and that would widen with freeze-thaw cycles if it wasn't addressed. She found it on a Monday morning when she went to check the overnight temperature in the curing room and felt a draft she hadn't felt before. She traced it to the crack, stood looking at it for a while, and ran the calculation in her head on what it would take to repair it, and how long that would take, and what it would do to her production schedule. The production schedule could not absorb a week of downtime without consequences for deliveries she'd already committed to. The crack could not be ignored without risk to those same deliveries. She went to Thomas Webb that afternoon. He looked at the crack, pressed his hand against it, stepped back, and considered it with the thoroughness of a man who knew what he was looking at. "Freeze got into the joint," he said. "The interior face needs repointing and then a lime wash coat over the whole section. Seals it and gives you some flex." "How long?" 2 days if the weather holds above freezing. You can't do lime work in a hard frost." "The weather won't hold above freezing," she said. "No," he agreed, "it won't." She asked how long it could be left without getting worse. He said 2 weeks, maybe 3, if she kept the interior fires going frequently enough to slow the freeze-thaw cycling, but that every week she waited made the repair larger. She went home and revised the production schedule, compressing the next 2 batches, and talking to Naomi about temporarily absorbing more production volume at the Carter Smokehouse. Naomi said yes without making it a negotiation, which was the thing about Naomi that Abigail had come to rely on. She didn't make simple things complicated. What Naomi did say, that same evening when they talked, was, "Lucy's been asking if she can start managing the Carter morning checks on her own. Temperature and draw, the things she'd be alone for." Abigail thought about this. "Can she?" "She's been doing it for 2 weeks without telling me," Naomi said dryly. "I found out when I noticed her logs were more detailed than mine." Abigail made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I think," Naomi said, with the careful tone of someone who'd been thinking about how to say something for a while, "that we need to make her role official, put it in writing, what she does, what she's responsible for, something that acknowledges what she's actually contributing." "Yes," Abigail said. "She's going to be better at this than either of us in 2 years," Naomi said, and there was something in her voice that was complicated, pride and grief, and something like defiance, the tone of a woman asserting a truth about someone she loved, against a world that had a habit of underestimating people who didn't communicate the way the world expected. "I know," Abigail said. "I know that already." The wall repair happened on a brief 3-day break in the cold in late January, with Thomas Webb doing the skilled work and Abigail's hands serving as a second pair because Webb was not as young as he'd once been and said so without embarrassment. They finished it in 2 days as he'd estimated, and the lime wash coat went on the morning of the 3rd day and dried by afternoon, and Abigail ran a test fire that evening and stood in the repaired smokehouse and felt no draft from anywhere. She thanked Webb, who said he'd been meaning to fix the east gate post on his pasture fence for 6 months, and if she wanted something to do with her afternoons. She told him she'd think about it, which meant yes, and they both knew it. By the 1st of February, something had shifted in the valley that Abigail noticed in small ways before she understood what it was. People at the feed store who had ignored her for years now spoke when she came in. The postmaster, who had always been perfectly civil but had a way of looking past her when he handed over her mail, now sometimes asked how the operation was going. These were small things, individually insignificant, but the morning Dale Pruitt came to her gate was not small and was not insignificant, and she did not pretend otherwise. She was in the yard when she heard the wagon. She looked up and recognized it and stayed where she was, which was the practical decision because she had a fence repair in the middle of it that she was not willing to leave half done. He pulled up and sat in the wagon for a moment before he got down, the kind of hesitation that in Abigail's experience meant someone had something to say that they'd been rehearsing. He was a big man, Pruitt, not heavy, just large, the way of men who'd done physical work their whole lives. He looked older than he had at the auction, or maybe she was just looking at him more carefully. He stopped a few feet away from where she was working and stood there. "I heard you're supplying the Meridian," he said. "Yes." "And the Harrison house?" "Yes." He looked at the fence she was repairing, then at the hillside, then at her. "I've got a sow who's not doing well on my current feed," he said. "I've been trying to figure out what it is for 6 weeks. My other animals are fine, just this one." He paused. "Someone mentioned you'd been working with heritage stock specific to that kind of issue." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man doing something his pride was making difficult, and he was doing it anyway, which was either admirable or just necessary, and she wasn't sure it mattered which. "Bring her by," she said. "I'll look at her." He nodded, started to turn back to his wagon, then stopped. "Those pigs I sold at auction in October," he said. "The ones you bought?" "Yes. I was getting rid of them because I didn't think they were worth the winter feed cost." He said this flatly, without inflection, like a man reading a record he'd rather not be reading. "I figured you'd lose everything." She held his gaze and didn't say anything. "I was wrong," he said. Just that. No performance around it. She went back to the fence. "Thursday morning," she said. "Bring her before 8." He got back in his wagon and drove away, and Abigail finished the fence repair with the same attention she gave every repair that needed to last through weather, which was all of them. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with both notebooks, hers and her father's, open side by side, something she'd started doing in the past month when she needed to think. The notebooks looked different. Her father's was worn and well used, the binding soft, the pages marked with years of handling. Hers was newer but filling faster than she'd expected, because there was more to record than she'd thought there would be. More variations, more adjustments, more observations that only made sense once she'd accumulated enough of them to see the pattern. She thought about Lucy's notebook, about the way it was filling up the same way. She turned to the last entry in her father's notebook, the one dated 4 years ago, the last thing he'd written in it before the illness made writing difficult. It was a short entry, almost a footnote. It said, "The smokehouse knows what it's doing. You just have to be there for it." She'd read that line 100 times. She thought she'd understood it. She was beginning to think she was still learning what it meant. Outside, the valley was settling into the particular cold silence of a February night, and in the Harper smokehouse, the coals from the afternoon's fire were doing what coals do in the long hours after the active work is done, holding warmth quietly in the dark, keeping alive in the stone what the fire had put there, patient and slow and in no hurry to be finished. Dale Pruitt brought the sow on Thursday morning at 7:40, which told Abigail he'd been sitting at the end of the road for some amount of time rather than arrive early and seem eager. The animal was a mature Berkshire cross, 7 years old by Pruitt's account, with a dull coat and the particular listlessness of a pig that wasn't in acute distress but wasn't right either. Abigail walked the fence line with her for 20 minutes while Pruitt stood at the gate with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had run out of his own ideas and was not fully comfortable with the situation that had created. She checked the sow's teeth and her feet and the texture of her skin along the spine and the way she held her weight when she stood still. Then she asked Pruitt what he'd been feeding her. He listed it. Standard grain mix, same as the rest of his herd, with some hay and whatever she foraged in the lot. "What's in the lot?" Abigail asked. "Same as always, some grass, some scrub. There's a stand of wild cherry along the east fence." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "Wild cherry leaves," she said. "The wilted ones are toxic to pigs. If she's been working that fence line and getting into fallen leaves..." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "The leaves came down early this year," he said slowly, the way of a man watching an obvious thing reveal itself in retrospect, and being honest enough not to pretend he'd considered it. "Pull her off that pasture and give her a week on clean ground with fresh water and good hay, and she'll most likely come right," Abigail said. "If she doesn't improve in 10 days, it's something else and you'll need the veterinarian." He stood there for a moment. Then he said, "How'd you know that?" "My father kept notes," she said. "He had a case like it 20 years ago. I read his notes." He nodded slowly, went to load the sow back into his wagon, then stopped again, one hand on the tailgate, not looking at her. "I've been thinking about what I said at the auction," he said, "in October." "You don't have to." "I'm going to say it anyway," he said, with the firmness of a man who'd clearly rehearsed something and intended to get through it. "What I said was mean. It wasn't just wrong about your business sense. It was mean, and I said it where people could hear it, and that wasn't right." She let the silence sit for a moment. "I know why you said it," she said. "That doesn't make it..." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but I know why you said it." He looked at her then, properly, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was not forgiveness exactly, and not friendship exactly, but was something real. The recognition between two people who have been on opposite sides of something and have both, in their different ways, been changed by it. "Your sow will be fine," she said. "Get her off that fence line." He drove away, and she went back to work. It was the kind of morning, cold, clear, the light coming flat and white off the snow that had settled on the ridge, where everything felt very particular and very present, the way February mornings sometimes did when winter had been going long enough that you'd stopped bracing against it and started just living in it. She had 3 things to accomplish before noon, and she started on the first one, which was the morning check on the Harper Smokehouse, where a long cure batch had been running since the previous evening. The smokehouse was holding temperature exactly where she needed it. She adjusted the right damper by a quarter turn, the same small adjustment she made every morning at this stage of a long run, because the overnight drop in outside temperature always pulled the draw slightly, and she'd stopped being surprised by it. She logged it in her notebook and went on to the second item, which was reviewing the production schedule against the standing orders from Clara Whitfield and the 2 hotel buyers, and adjusting for the fact that one of Naomi's pasture rotations had run 3 days long because of a fence repair that had taken longer than expected. She was working through the schedule at the kitchen table when Lucy arrived on the Carter wagon at 9:15, coming in through the gate the way she always did now. Directly, purposefully, with the notebook under her arm and her eyes already moving toward the smokehouse to assess the color of what was coming from the vent before she'd even set down her bag. She stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and signed something. Abigail had been learning, slowly, imperfectly, with the same systematic stubbornness she brought to everything she didn't know yet. She'd borrowed a reference book from the county library, and she'd been watching Naomi's hands for 3 months, and she'd been paying attention to Lucy's face when she signed, which was as expressive and specific as other people's voices. She caught most of it. "Smoke color is good," she said. "You checked already." Lucy nodded, came to the table and looked at the schedule Abigail was working on, and after a moment pointed at a line and signed a question. "The Harrison House order," Abigail said. "They moved the pickup date by 4 days. It compresses the resting period by 2 days on that batch." Lucy considered this and then signed something Abigail had to ask her to repeat more slowly. "What if we start that batch 2 days earlier and run the Harrison and Meridian cures on parallel instead of staggered?" Lucy nodded. Abigail looked at the schedule. It worked. It required running the Carter Smokehouse and the Harper Smokehouse, on the same day for the first time in 3 weeks, which they'd done before and managed, but it was harder. She considered it for a moment and then marked the change on the schedule. "You're right," she said. "That's better." Lucy sat down across from her and opened her own notebook and started working on something. And they sat that way for an hour in the particular easy quiet of two people who have spent enough time working in close proximity that they don't need to fill the silence with anything. It was in the middle of that quiet hour that Abigail allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to actually look at where she was. Not the schedule, not the numbers, not the next problem in the line of problems that had been the texture of every day for the past 4 months. Just where she was. She had 2 smokehouses running. She had standing orders from 4 buyers representing some of the most respected establishments in the region. She had a partner who was competent and direct, and who had come to her, which was still something she turned over occasionally in her mind. The fact that Naomi Carter, who had 15 years in heritage livestock and a husband who'd built a professional smokehouse from his grandfather's knowledge, had come to her front gate because she'd heard about a 27-year-old woman running a one-person operation on a rocky hillside with 47 animals nobody else had wanted. She had a debt that was almost gone. The remaining balance on the Harper property debt was $1,200. She'd checked the figure so many times over the past 3 months that she could have written it in her sleep, could have found it in the dark the way you can find a bruise without looking. $1,200 between where she was and where she needed to be, which was on land that nobody could take from her. At their current production rate and pricing, she had the $1,200 in 6 weeks. Maybe 5 if the Harrison house confirmed the additional standing order that Garrison Hale had hinted at in his last communication. 6 weeks. She'd been managing the fear of losing the land for so long that the proximity of not losing it had a quality she hadn't fully anticipated, which was that it made her slightly more afraid than she'd been when it was further away, because now it was close enough to be real in a way that the distant future hadn't been. She didn't say any of this to Lucy, who was working through something in her notebook with her pen moving steadily across the page. She just put her head down and got on with the schedule. The Harrison house confirmation came the following week, in a letter from Garrison Hale that was characteristically brief and characteristically precise. They were doubling their standing order effective the following month and requesting a conversation about the possibility of a branded provision. The hotel wanted to put her name on the menu card alongside the product. She read that part twice. Her name. On a menu card. At the Harrison house. She put the letter on the table and went outside and stood in the yard for a while in the cold, not because she needed air, but because the kitchen suddenly felt slightly too small for what she was feeling, which was large and complicated and not entirely comfortable, the way real things often are when they arrive after you've been working toward them long enough that you've forgotten to expect them. Naomi came that afternoon for a scheduled production meeting and found Abigail in the smokehouse going through the curing room inventory with the focused efficiency that Naomi had come to recognize as what Abigail did when her emotions were too busy for her to sit still. Naomi read the letter without being asked, because it was on the workbench and she'd seen Abigail's face when she came in. She put it down and said, "You need to decide how you feel about your name being on something." "I know," Abigail said. "Some people don't like it, the visibility." "I know," she said again. "I'm deciding." Naomi let it rest, which was one of the things about Naomi that Abigail had come to genuinely value. She understood the difference between a person processing something and a person who needed help processing it, and she didn't treat the first kind like the second. They worked through the production meeting, and by the time they were done, Abigail had decided. She wrote back to Garrison Hale the same evening, accepting the branded provision arrangement. She wrote it in her plain, direct way, without making a thing of it, because making a thing of it felt like too much performance for something that was simply true. She'd made this product. She'd put herself into it the way her father had put himself into his smokehouse, and her mother had put herself into the cure blend that Abigail still made exactly as her mother had written it. And if there was a name on the menu card, it should be the right name. She sent the letter and went back to work. Naomi's herd had grown through the winter. She'd made 2 strategic purchases in January from a farm 2 counties over that was dissolving, acquiring 15 animals whose bloodlines she knew and whose condition she'd personally evaluated before agreeing to the price. These additions to the production pipeline meant that in the spring, when the acorn season was still months away, they would need to expand the pasture rotation and develop a supplemental feed strategy that maintained the product character without the primary acorn component. This was the problem that occupied most of Abigail's evenings in February, sitting with her notebooks and her father's notebook and the collection of reference materials she'd accumulated and working through the feed chemistry in the same slow, patient way she'd worked through the smoke chemistry in the beginning. She was not a chemist. She kept running up against the edges of what she could understand without formal training, and it frustrated her the way all honest limits do. Not because they couldn't be worked around, but because she wanted to understand the thing directly rather than working around it. It was Thomas Webb who mentioned, on a Saturday when he came by with a jar of winter pear preserves from his wife's stores, that the Agricultural College in Whitmore had a correspondence program for working farmers that covered animal nutrition and feed science. "My wife did it years ago," he said. "She wanted to understand what the dairy cows were eating and why it mattered." "How long does it take?" Abigail asked. "Depends on how fast you work through it. She did it in 8 months. "I don't have 8 months," Abigail said. "Most people don't," Webb said. "She did it in 4, but she didn't sleep much that winter." Abigail enrolled the following week. The correspondence materials arrived in a thick package and she opened it on the kitchen table the same way she'd opened everything else that had come to this table as a challenge, by reading the whole thing through first, then making a list of what she needed to understand first, then starting at the beginning of that list. It was hard in the way that learning things you've needed for a while but didn't have access to is hard. The frustrating combination of it being slower than she wanted and making more sense than she'd expected. She did the coursework in the evenings, after the notebooks and the schedules, and she missed sleep the way Webb's wife had missed it, and she didn't regret it. The month of March arrived the way March arrives in the valley, with the aggressive, contradictory quality of a season that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet, alternating between days that smelled like spring and nights that were still January. The snow on the ridge thinned and then came back and then thinned again, and the creek ran high with melt, and the oaks on the hillside were still bare but starting to have the quality of things that were about to not be bare. The senator had developed, over the winter, an unmistakable awareness of the season's shift. Abigail noticed it first in the way she moved in the mornings. More energy, more territory covered in her pasture rotation, less time in the sheltered corner she'd preferred through the hard, cold months. The other animals responded to whatever the senator did, because that was what they did, and the whole herd had a different character in March than it had in December, looser and more purposeful at the same time. Lucy noticed it too. She'd started spending more time in the pastures during her visits, not managing the animals. She was there for the smokehouses, but watching them, and occasionally signing observations to Naomi or to Abigail that turned out to be useful information about individual animals' condition or behavior. One afternoon in mid-March, she signed something to Abigail directly, without going through Naomi. Abigail caught about half of it, which was improving. She asked Lucy to slow down. Lucy slowed down and signed again, pointing at the senator as she did. Abigail looked at the senator, who was doing nothing in particular, standing near the creek bank in her customary spot, looking out over the pasture with the expression she always had, which was the expression of an animal who has made her assessment of the situation and found it acceptable. "She's getting old," Abigail said. Lucy nodded, then signed something else, slower, watching Abigail's face to see if she was keeping up. "I know," Abigail said, and she did know, had known since winter, that the senator was slowing in the way that old animals slow when the aging that's been happening invisibly starts to become visible. "She's had a good year." Lucy considered this for a moment and then signed something brief. Abigail caught it clearly. "Better than good," she agreed. She stood there with Lucy for a while, both of them looking at the senator, who was doing nothing differently than she'd done every morning for 5 months, and who was, by any measure, the animal most responsible for making Abigail talk to herself in the pasture in those first strange weeks when the whole enterprise was still just math on a napkin, and stubbornness, and the smell of a smokehouse that hadn't been lit in years. The debt payment happened on a Wednesday in the last week of March. She'd known the date for 2 weeks, had had the money set aside since the second week of the month, had checked the figure against the ledger twice a day in the way of someone who can't quite believe an arithmetic problem has finally resolved but keeps checking the work anyway. She drove to the county seat alone, which was a choice she'd made deliberately, not because she wanted the moment to herself for sentimental reasons, exactly, but because it was her land, her family's land, Her father's 43 acres of rocky hillside with its stubborn soil and its old oaks and its stone smokehouse, and the settling of the debt against it was something she wanted to carry herself to the finish line. The bank officer was not Gerald Holt. Holt had apparently moved to a position in another county sometime in December, and the woman who processed Abigail's final payment was younger than he'd been, with a business-like efficiency that Abigail appreciated. She signed the final documents. The officer stamped them and handed her a receipt and the clear title document, which was a single piece of paper that in practical terms contained nothing Abigail hadn't already known, but that in actual terms was everything. She read it in the wagon before she drove home, sitting in the cold outside the bank, with the reins across her knees and the paper in her hands, reading the legal description of the Harper homestead in the county's flat, factual language, the acreage, the boundary descriptions, the name that appeared on the title. Harper. Her name. Her land. She folded it carefully and put it inside her coat, against her chest, which she recognized was somewhat theatrical but did anyway, because some moments deserve to be felt in the body and not just in the head. She drove home. The first person she told was Thomas Webb, because he was at his east fence when she came up the road, and he looked at her face and said, "You did it." "I did it," she said. He nodded, with the particular nod of a man who had been watching from nearby long enough to understand what the thing meant, and who didn't try to make it into more or less than what it was. "Your father would have," he started. "I know," she said. He nodded again. "Your mother, too," he added. She drove the rest of the way home with her hand on her coat over the folded paper. The second person she told was Naomi that evening, who received the information with the same practical directness she brought to most things. A moment of real quiet, and then, "Good. Now we can stop spending energy on that and put it somewhere useful." Which was exactly right. The third person was not a person. She went out to the lower pasture in the last of the daylight and found the senator at the creek bank, which was where she usually was at this hour, and she stood at the fence and told her. "It's ours," she said. "The land is ours." The senator regarded her with the chronically unimpressed expression that was simply her face, her default mode of being in the world, and then she turned and walked away toward the evening feeding area with the slow, deliberate authority that she'd had since the first day Abigail walked her home from the auction. It was, Abigail thought, a very appropriate response. Spring came fully in April, the way it does in the valley, suddenly and completely, like a decision that had been building for a long time and finally got made all at once. The hillside that had been bare brown and snow-patched through the winter went green in what felt like a single week, and the oaks began leafing out, and the creek settled from its high, muddy March run into the clear, quick-moving water of warm weather. The herd moved differently in spring. Everything did. The production schedule that Abigail and Naomi had built through the winter held through the first 2 months of spring and then needed adjusting. Not because anything had failed, but because the business had continued to grow in ways that consistently outpaced their conservative estimates. Clara Whitfield's network had proven more extensive than Abigail had fully anticipated. A food correspondent for a paper in the nearest major city had written a small piece about the Meridian Hotel's new signature provision, describing the flavor profile in terms that Abigail found slightly purple, but that apparently resonated with readers, because 2 new wholesale inquiries arrived within the week. She and Naomi sat with those inquiries for 3 days before deciding. "We can't take both," Naomi said. "Not at the volume they're asking, not without compromising the process." "I know," Abigail said. "So we say no to one of them." "Or we say not yet," Abigail said. "And we set a timeline for when we could say yes." Naomi looked at her. "That's a different answer than no." "It's a different situation than no," Abigail said. "We're not at our limit because we can't do it. We're at our limit because we're not ready to do it yet. Those are different things." They wrote back to one inquiry with a yes and to the other with a detailed letter explaining their production constraints and the timeline on which they expected to be able to meet the requested volume, with an invitation to revisit the conversation in 6 months. Abigail wrote the letter herself, and Naomi approved it, and Clara Whitfield, when Abigail mentioned it to her, said it was the right decision and that the 6-month timeline was, if anything, conservative. "You're underselling your own pace," Clara said. "I'm not underselling it," Abigail said. "I'm being honest about it." Clara looked at her with the expression she sometimes had, the slightly surprised look that Abigail had come to recognize as Clara revising an expectation she'd held. Most people in your position would take the contract and figure out the logistics afterward, she said. I know, Abigail said. That's how you end up delivering something that isn't what you promised. She didn't say it with judgment. It was just true. The spring was full of decisions like that. Decisions that required knowing exactly what the product was and what it required and where the limits of what they could do without changing it were. Abigail had spent the winter in the correspondence coursework, and what she'd learned about feed science had given her a language for things she'd been doing by instinct, which turned out to be both validating and useful. She'd developed a spring supplement protocol for the acorn-off months, a specific combination of legume pasture and fermented feed and mineral provision that maintained the fat quality through the season when the oaks weren't providing. She tested it methodically and compared the results against the winter production and found that the flavor difference was present, but within the range she'd defined as acceptable. It wasn't perfect. She wrote that in her notebook with the same directness she wrote everything. Spring production, distinct from autumn-winter benchmark. Fat quality maintained within acceptable range. Smoke response slightly faster. Adjust early phase timing by approximately 15 minutes. What she didn't write in the notebook, but that she thought about, was that the imperfection had a character of its own that some people might actually prefer. She thought about her father's note, "The smokehouse knows what it's doing," and extended it in her own mind to include the season, the animals, the particular moment in the year. Every batch was the same process, and every batch was slightly different because the living things involved in it were slightly different, and that wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the system. Hector Graves came to her in May. Not to the gate. He drove all the way up the track to the yard and knocked on the front door of the house, which was different from how anyone else came, and which told her before she opened the door that this was a different kind of visit than the feed store exchanges they'd been having since December. He was carrying his hat, which he'd taken off before she opened the door, and he stood in the yard with it in both hands and got directly to the reason he'd come. "I've been thinking about retiring the Graves operation," he said. "Not now. In 3 or 4 years. I'm 68, and I've been doing this since I was 19, and I've got no one to pass it to." She waited. "I want to talk to you about whether there's any part of what I've built that would be useful to you." He said it without preamble or apology, the way he said everything. The upper pasture, specifically, 40 acres of hill land adjacent to the ridge, good drainage, heavy oak canopy in the east section. I've been grazing it for 30 years, and the soil is solid. Abigail looked at him. "I'm not talking about charity," he said quickly. "I'm talking about a business arrangement, a lease with right of first purchase when I'm ready to sell. I've watched what you're building, and I want it adjacent to what I've built, not developed into something else after I'm gone." The thing about Hector Graves was that he had been the person in the valley most publicly certain that the Harper homestead should have been sold after her father died, and he had never apologized for that opinion, and she had never expected him to. He was not a man who operated in apology. He was a man who operated in assessment, and his assessments changed when the evidence changed, and she respected that even when it was inconvenient. "Why me?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Because you know what you're doing with the land," he said, "and because—" He stopped. Started again. "Your father and I were not always on easy terms. We disagreed about things. But he knew this valley the way not many people know a place, and he cared about it the way even fewer people care about anything." He looked out at the hillside for a moment. "You're his." She sat with that for a moment. "I'd want to walk the upper pasture before I agreed to anything," she said. "Of course," he said. "And I'd want Thomas Webb's opinion on the water situation on the east section." "Fine. And the lease terms need to account for the production timeline. I can't be paying for land I can't run animals on yet." "Write what you need," he said. "I'll look at it." They walked the upper pasture the following Saturday, with Webb along for the water assessment he'd agreed to give without Abigail having to ask twice. The land was exactly what Graves had described, 40 acres of varied hill terrain with the heavy oak presence in the east section that would, in the autumn, produce more acorns than she could use in a single season at current scale. The drainage was good. The existing fencing was old but solid. There was a stone foundation near the upper boundary where a building had once stood, and she stood on it for a while looking at the view. The valley below, the ridge above, the line of old oaks throwing their still leafless shadows in the May morning light. Webb came and stood beside her on the foundation. "Good stone," he said, looking at what remained of the base. For a smokehouse? She said. He considered it. If someone knew what they were doing with stone. I know someone, she said, and he looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to amusement she'd ever seen on his face. The lease was signed in June. The summer was the busiest period of work Abigail had known, including the first winter, because the combination of the two existing operations and the preparation work on the Graves upper pasture, fencing, water system, land management, required more hours than the day comfortably held and required her to finally, for the first time, hire outside help. This was harder than she'd expected, not the finding of help. There were people in the valley looking for work, and Naomi had connections through 15 years of running her own operation who she could vouch for. The hard part was the delegation itself, the business of handing pieces of a process she'd built from nothing to people who hadn't been there when it was nothing, who hadn't read the notebooks or failed through 6 smokehouse trials or walked 47 pigs home through the mud in October. She had to teach what she knew, and teaching it forced her, again, to find language for things that lived in her hands and her nose and the accumulated knowledge of a winter spent failing in productive ways. Lucy helped her with this, which was something she hadn't anticipated. What Lucy had been doing in her own notebook over the past 8 months, it turned out, was developing a documentation system, detailed, systematic, organized differently from Abigail's notebooks in the way that a different mind organizes the same information. Lucy's records were more visual, with diagrams of fire positions and damper states and smoke color charts that she'd developed from her own observations. And they were, Abigail admitted to herself, in some ways clearer than her own notes for the purpose of teaching someone who wasn't already inside the process. She asked Lucy if she could use them. Lucy signed, "They're for both of us." They've always been for both of us. She'd been preparing for this moment, Abigail realized, for months, in the way that a 14-year-old with exceptional observational skills and a great deal of quiet time and absolutely nothing to prove prepares for something she can see coming before the adults around her are ready to see it. She told Naomi. Naomi said, "I know." "You knew?" "I suspected," Naomi said. "She's been doing it since February. I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure how you'd take it." "How I'd—" Abigail stopped. "You thought I'd be threatened by it." Naomi gave her a look that was honest without being unkind. Abigail thought about it. Thought about whether she would have been threatened by it in November, in December, in the early months when the process was still fragile and still entirely hers, in the way that new things are entirely yours before they become larger than yourself. Maybe. Probably. "She should be paid," Abigail said, "for what she's contributing." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "She's 14. She's doing skilled work that directly affects the quality of our production," Abigail said. "People get paid for that." "Her father left her something," Naomi said carefully. "She doesn't need—" "This isn't about need," Abigail said. "It's about what's right." Naomi looked at her for a long time. "You're going to be difficult to argue with as a business partner," she said. "I was difficult to argue with before I was your business partner," Abigail said. Naomi made the sound that was close to a laugh, and didn't fight it this time. "They paid Lucy." She signed something when Naomi told her that Abigail couldn't quite follow, but Naomi's expression told her it was the right thing to have done. The first autumn came around faster than Abigail was ready for, which was how it always goes when a year has been full enough that time moves at a different speed than the clock. October arrived with the acorns, and with the particular quality of light that happens in the valley when the season is really turning. That amber late afternoon quality that seems to slow things down even as everything is actually speeding up for the winter ahead. The oaks on her hillside dropped heavy, and the oaks on the upper pasture that she was now managing dropped heavier, and she had more animals on better land in better condition than she'd had at this time the previous year. And the production schedule for the coming winter was 3 times what it had been when she'd burned the first fire in her repaired smokehouse 14 months ago. She went to the livestock auction on the last Saturday of October. Not to buy. She had everything she needed. She went because it was the last Saturday of the month, and she'd been going her whole life, and because there was a particular kind of accounting that happened when you returned to the place where something began. The yard was the same, the smell was the same, the sounds were the same, the particular voice of the auctioneer, the shifting and complaint of animals, the low murmur of men assessing things with practiced eyes. She stood near the fence on the south side where she'd stood last October, and she watched the morning run through. Dale Pruitt was there. He saw her and nodded, and she nodded back, and they didn't have a conversation, which was exactly right. His sow, she'd heard from Webb, had recovered fully from the wild cherry situation and was back in her pasture in good health. She was watching a pen of young stock near the back when she heard it. A comment, two men she didn't know well, somewhere behind her and to the right. She caught enough of it. Something about the Harper woman. Something about who'd have thought it. She didn't catch the specifics and didn't turn around. She didn't need to hear the specifics. She stayed for another hour and then drove home. The senator died in late October, which was not a surprise. She'd been slowing all through September, doing less, eating less, spending more time in her sheltered spot by the creek bank with the particular stillness of an old animal making peace with something. Abigail found her on a Tuesday morning in the creek bank spot, which was right. It was where she'd have chosen to be. She told Lucy that day. Lucy sat with it for a moment and then signed something that Abigail, who had been working hard on her comprehension all year, caught clearly. She was here for the whole thing, Lucy signed, from the beginning to the end. Yes, Abigail said, she was. She buried the senator on the hillside under one of the oaks she'd spent her life eating from, because it seemed appropriate, and because the Harper land was big enough for that, and because there was nobody to tell her she couldn't. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She just did it in the early morning before the day started, and when she was done, she stood at the fence for a while and looked at the other animals going about their morning with the ordinary, ongoing business of being alive. And then she went in and started the Smokehouse fire. The winter that followed was not easy. The winters in the valley are not easy, and she had stopped expecting them to be. What it was productive and stable and organized in a way that the previous winter hadn't been. 2 smokehouses running on a reliable schedule, a herd at optimum size and condition, a documentation system that meant Abigail could finally sleep through a full night without getting up at 3 in the morning to check a temperature because she didn't trust anyone else to have written it down. She finished the agricultural correspondence course in January, 14 months after she'd started it, faster than the program intended, and with exam scores that earned a letter from the course director commenting on the practical detail of her written responses. She put the letter in the same drawer as the title document for the Harper homestead, which was the drawer she'd assigned to things that were true and permanent and didn't need to be looked at every day to remain true and permanent. It was Naomi who first said the word that Abigail had been thinking, but not saying. They were in the Harper kitchen in February, with the notebooks and the production schedule spread up across the table, and Naomi looked up from the figures they'd been working through and said, "This is a legacy." Abigail looked up. "I mean it in the specific sense," Naomi said, "not as a compliment, as a description. What you've built here, what we've built, is the kind of thing that has a future beyond whoever started it." Abigail thought about her father's notebook, about her mother's handwriting on a folded piece of paper tucked inside the back cover, about Lucy's notebook sitting on the Carter Smokehouse workbench, filling up with the precise visual language of a 15-year-old girl who saw the world more clearly than most people twice her age. "Yes," she said. "That means it has to be structured like one," Naomi said. "At some point. Not now, maybe, but at some point." "I know," Abigail said. And she did know. She'd been knowing it for a while in the background of everything else, the way you know things that aren't urgent yet, but that are real. She looked out the kitchen window at the smokehouse, from which a steady line of blue-gray smoke was rising into the cold February air, with the calm regularity of something that had been doing this for a while and expected to keep doing it. 14 months ago, she had stood in the doorway of that building with a lantern and cold ash under her hands, and a notebook full of her dead father's handwriting, and the absolute knowledge that she had no other option but to make it work. She had not at that moment been certain it would work. She'd been certain it was the right direction, which is not the same thing. Certainty of direction and certainty of outcome are different animals, and confusing them is how people lose their nerve when the outcome gets hard, because they thought they'd been promised a result when actually they'd only been pointed at a road. The road had been hard. Parts of it had been harder than she'd told anyone, because there were things you go through alone even when you're not technically alone. The interior weight of it, the 4 in the morning variety of doubt that lives in the space between waking up and deciding to get up, which is a space that nobody can help you through. She thought about what she'd carried into this kitchen on the day she turned 27. The tax notice, and the frozen pump, and the debt, and the fact of being alone in a way that her parents' deaths had made permanent, and the body she'd carried her whole life as both her own and the world's occasion for comment. She thought about Dale Pruitt at the auction railing. She thought about Gerald Holt's office, and the way the silence had done the rest of the work. She did not think of those things with bitterness. That had never been useful, and she'd known it early. What she thought of them with was the specific clarity of someone who knows exactly what something cost, which is different from resentment and different from indifference, and is its own kind of knowledge, the knowledge of the real price of the real thing. The real thing was this: the land, the smokehouses, the notebooks, Lucy's notebook, the letter in the drawer, Naomi across the kitchen table, the herd on the hillside in the cold February morning, doing what they did, getting on with it. She looked at the figure at the bottom of the production summary they'd been working through. It was a real number in the real world, and it meant real things, and one of the things it meant was that she was not going to lose this land, and another was that the thing she'd been building was going to outlast the conditions that had required it to be built in the first place. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. "All right," she said to Naomi, "let's talk about structure." Outside, the smoke rose and the hillside held its cold, and the oaks stood in their winter bareness above the soil they'd been feeding for 100 years, patient and indifferent and permanent in the way that living things can be permanent when they've found their ground. The Harper homestead was not what it had been. It was what it was going to be. And Abigail Harper, 28 years old, flower on her sleeve and a pen in her hand and her father's land under her feet, opened a new page in her notebook and began.